The quiet in a chapel full of mourning is the coldest thing I've ever experienced. As James would have desired, the funeral was straightforward. White blooms, dark suits, and that ancient song he hummed when he felt no one was paying attention. My hands were shaking so much that I had to hold on to the sides of the casket to keep from collapsing while I stood there. Neighbors, co-workers, and even Evan's college classmate who traveled from Vermont came and departed. Like it was a formality, as if my life hadn't just ended, they shook my hand, muttered something like, "He was a good man," and went on. Grief moves in waves, which is something no one tells you. It smashes you first, then it retreats, then it suddenly drowns you once more. I wasn't in tears. I was unable to. I was in a state of numbness that made me wonder whether I was still alive, someplace beyond thinking and beyond sobbing. She entered at that point. I didn't know who she was. She didn't wear funeral attire, just trousers, a beige sweater, and a baby in her arms. No black dress, no veil. When everyone else had arrived to bury a guy, there was a baby in the chapel. She brought fresh vitality with her. She made no hesitation. She didn't pause to pray or glance at the seats. She came directly up to me after walking down the aisle, past the altar, and past the folks who were muttering behind their hands. I blinked. I briefly considered the possibility that I knew her but was unable to identify her. She could have been a co-worker of James, or perhaps she came to console me. What may the baby have been? Her grandson? A kid of a cousin? Then she started talking. She spoke clearly, softly, and without regret. "He is the brother of your son." The infant whimpered a bit and shifted closer to her chest as it stirred in her arms. Unable to understand the words, I gazed at her as they replayed in my head. "Is that your son's brother?" My mouth became parched. "What?" Just above a whisper, I inquired. Moving closer, she held the infant out to me politely and without force, as though she were giving me a borrowed scarf or a grocery bag. "I apologize for having to do this here, but I had no other way to get in touch with you," she stated. I didn't want him to grow up in ignorance of his origins. I glanced down at the infant, who was maybe 6 months old. He had a dimple on his left face, light complexion, and hazel eyes. A little hand grasped his blanket's edge and drew it up to his lips. My knees became weak. I stumbled and caught myself on the corner of the coffin, but I didn't faint. I was brought back to the present time by the wooden edge that dug into my palm. There were people all around me. Those who observed, those who were whispering were suddenly more audible. I made myself glance up at her. "Who are you?" I inquired. My voice broke. Even I couldn't hear the sound. She didn't respond. She simply gazed at me as if I already understood, as if the parts were in place. I simply hadn't connected the dots yet. At last she responded, "I'll go." I didn't come to stir things up. All I wanted to do was what was right. Micah is his name. Micah. The name hit me like a burden I wasn't prepared to bear. However, behind the bewilderment, sickness, and sadness, I sensed a change. I glanced at the infant once again, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of James. The man in the coffin, no. My spouse. The guy who would hoist Evan onto his shoulders and whirl him around until they both collapsed in laughter. The man who kissed my forehead when I was sick and whispered that he'd take care of everything. I saw that man in the curve of the baby's chin. My breath caught, and in that moment, standing by my husband's coffin, holding on to nothing but the casket's edge and the last pieces of a life I thought I understood, I realized I didn't know everything. Not even close. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. If you had asked me 6 months ago what my life looked like, I would have said peaceful, predictable even. I was Carlin Marrero, 58 years old, married to James for 35 of those years. We lived in a modest brick house in Cincinnati with green shutters and a creaky porch swing James insisted on fixing every spring, but never actually did. Our only child, Evan, had grown up and moved out nearly a decade ago, but he still came by every Sunday like clockwork. Always hungry, always with something new to complain about from work. I loved those visits. I'd make too much food, and he'd pretend not to take leftovers, but I always found the containers missing from the fridge by Monday morning. James had worked in supply chain logistics for nearly 20 years. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. He left every morning at 7:45 a.m. sharp, and came home at 5:15 like the world ran on his wristwatch. He hated surprises, loved black coffee, and listened to smooth jazz while paying the bills at the kitchen table. There was comfort in his routine, even when I sometimes wished he'd break it just to dance with me in the kitchen or book a random weekend getaway. I wasn't unhappy. Not really. My days were filled with purpose. I ran a little flower shop downtown that used to belong to my mother, Lynette. She had taught me the language of blooms, how tulips said forgiveness, how peonies whispered regret. I always loved how flowers spoke when people couldn't. James wasn't a romantic, but every anniversary he'd bring me yellow roses because they were my mother's favorite. I used to think that meant something. There was a rhythm to our life. On Saturdays, we did groceries together. He pushed the cart while I read labels out loud and rolled my eyes when he snuck in cookies. Sunday nights, we'd watch reruns of detective shows while folding laundry. Sometimes he'd nod off with a sock in his hand, and I'd watch his face, lined and tired but familiar, steady safe. Of course, we had our arguments, little things, mostly money, Evan's choices, whether we should finally renovate the kitchen, but nothing earth-shattering. Nothing I couldn't brush off after a night of sleep. I figured that's what real marriage looked like after 3 decades. Not movie magic, but partnership, quiet understanding, 1,000 small sacrifices made without being asked. That's why the car crash blindsided me in more ways than one. James had left the house early that day, earlier than usual, saying he had a meeting in Dayton. He kissed my cheek while I was still half asleep and promised he'd be back by dinner. He never made it home. A semi ran a red light on Route 35 and hit him head-on. The officers said he died instantly. I didn't even get to say goodbye. In the days that followed, I moved through our house like a ghost. Every corner held pieces of him, the shaving cream on the bathroom sink, the unwashed coffee mug beside the bed, his shoes lined up neatly at the door. I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. It felt like erasing someone who had just been breathing beside me. People showed up with casseroles and cards, and I nodded through their condolences like I was reading a script I hadn't rehearsed. My mother came by and tried to get me to eat. I couldn't. Evan stayed 2 nights, but his grief looked like anger. He snapped at everything. The mail piling up, the funeral plans, even the pastor's tone. I think seeing me so still scared him. Through it all, I kept telling myself one thing. At least I knew who James was. At least we had a good life. No secrets, no scandals, just love that matured into something quieter, more enduring. That was my anchor. That was the one truth I clung to when the world started spinning. But that truth, like so many others, wasn't whole. It was only what I had chosen to see. Looking back now, I realize how much I didn't question. How much I took comfort in routine and labeled it devotion. I thought I had everything. A good man, a peaceful home, a shared history. What I didn't know was that grief wasn't the only stranger about to walk through my door. It started with socks. Not just any socks. Tiny, blue, and soft as clouds. The kind with little rubber grips on the bottom. Shaped like stars. I found them while doing laundry one Thursday afternoon, buried deep in the pocket of James' overnight duffel bag. He had come back from another conference in Columbus the night before, dropped his bag in the hallway like usual, and gone straight to the fridge for a beer. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I went to unpack his things, there they were, baby socks. At first I laughed. I actually stood there in the laundry room, holding them in one hand like some sort of silly mystery. My first thought was Evan. Maybe he had brought his goddaughter by the house a while ago and forgotten to tell me. Or maybe James had helped a coworker with their kid, and the socks got mixed up in the shuffle. James wasn't great with kids, but he wasn't heartless either. There had to be an explanation. Still, something in me shifted. I brought the socks to him while he was watching the game. "Do these look familiar?" I asked, half teasing, half curious. He looked up, blinked, then chuckled like I'd shown him an old photo. "Those? Oh yeah. A guy at the conference had his kid there crawling all over the place. Must have ended up in my bag. Toss them." He said it so easily, so casually. I stood there holding them for another second, unsure why my chest suddenly felt tight. Then I nodded and walked back to the kitchen. I didn't toss them. I slid them into the back of my nightstand drawer beneath an old handkerchief and a dried corsage James had given me at a banquet 10 years ago. Something about them felt like a question I hadn't yet learned how to ask. That weekend, James left again. Another conference, another hotel room with a continental breakfast and long presentations about logistics and warehouse automation. At least that's what he told me. I packed his shirts and socks and kissed his cheek and smiled as he backed out of the driveway. But once the taillights disappeared, I sat down on the edge of our bed and just stared at the carpet. I kept trying to convince myself it was nothing. After 35 years of marriage, a woman knows her husband, knows his rhythms, his tells, his stories. But the more I paid attention, the more cracks I started to see. His cologne had changed. Subtle, but sharper. Not the musky cedar he'd always worn, but something newer, lighter, almost sweet. I'd asked him once, and he said the store had run out of the old one. He didn't sound irritated. He just shrugged like it didn't matter. He started texting more, too. At dinner, during TV shows, even in bed, he kept the phone face down. When I asked who it was, he smiled and said, "Work stuff." That was his favorite excuse, a shield he rarely had to explain. The oddest part was that he started coming home looking lighter, like a man freshly showered from something other than water. I couldn't describe it any better than that. A calmness aglow. And when I reached for his hand across the couch, he'd squeeze it, but his eyes were already back on the screen. One night, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed just once. I didn't touch it, but I looked at the name that flashed across the screen. Belle. Not a name I recognized. Not a cousin, not anyone from his office, as far as I knew. I stared at it until the screen went dark. Then I got up, walked into the kitchen, and started dinner like I always did. Chopping onions, boiling pasta, smiling at nothing in particular. I told myself it was a coworker, maybe someone new, maybe a wrong number, maybe. But something inside me, something old and quiet, was stirring. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was a whisper, a warning bell. The kind you hear just once faintly, but never forget. The baby socks, the new cologne, the hidden messages. They didn't make sense yet, but they would. And when they did, I would no longer be the woman smiling through chopped onions and excuses. I just didn't know it yet. It didn't happen overnight. That's the cruel part. If James had screamed at me, or slammed the door, or walked out, I would have had something to hold on to. But this was a slow unraveling, a quiet kind of disappearance. It began in the mornings. For 30 years, he made coffee for both of us. Black for him, one sugar for me. Sometimes he'd pour mine into my favorite mug, the one Evan made in art class that leans to the side like it's drunk, and set it by the window where the light came in. He hadn't done that in months. I started making my own coffee, pouring it into whatever mug was clean. He never seemed to notice. Then it moved into conversation, or the lack of it. I'd come home from the flower shop, arms full of eucalyptus and tulips, my fingers stained green, smelling like soil. I used to tell him about the customers, the regulars, like Mrs. Draper who bought daisies every Tuesday, or the young man who proposed in the store with a ring hidden in a bouquet. James used to listen. Sometimes he'd ask questions, even smile. Lately, though, I'd talk and he'd just nod. His eyes would be on his phone or the television. One night, I stopped mid-sentence just to see if he noticed. He didn't. At dinner, we used to hold hands before eating just for a second. It was never some grand ritual, just a quiet squeeze, a connection. One night, I reached for his hand, and he was already scrolling through his messages. I waited, my hand hovering between us. He didn't look up. I pulled it back, rested it in my lap, and said nothing. What stung the most weren't the big things. It was the tiny shifts that piled up until I didn't recognize the life I was standing in. The way he stopped asking if I needed anything from the store. The way he'd sleep facing the other way, curled tight like someone preparing for flight. He still said, "Love you," when he left for work, but it sounded like a reflex, like he was reciting something he'd memorized years ago and no longer felt. One afternoon, I tried to surprise him with lunch at his office. I made a sandwich the way he liked it. Light mayo, extra pickles, wrapped it neatly and drove across town. I waited in the lobby for over 20 minutes. When I finally asked the receptionist if she could check, she smiled awkwardly and said, "Mr. Maroro isn't in today. He's working remotely." I nodded like that made sense, like I hadn't just driven across the city with a brown paper bag and a heart full of effort. I got back in the car, drove home, and sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Even Evan noticed it during one of his visits. "Is Dad okay?" he asked over lunch. He barely said 2 words to me. I wanted to defend James. I wanted to say he was tired or stressed or dealing with work issues, but all I could say was, "I don't know anymore." I started feeling like a ghost in my own home. I'd walk through the hallway and see pictures on the walls, vacations, birthdays, the 3 of us smiling in matching sweaters, and feel like I was watching someone else's life, someone who once had meaning, someone who once mattered. I tried to reach for him in small ways. I bought him a new pair of cufflinks for our anniversary. Silver, engraved with his initials. He thanked me, gave me a kiss on the forehead, and left them on the nightstand. He never wore them, not once. There was no yelling, no betrayal I could point to, just the steady erosion like a river wearing down a rock. Not all at once, but drip by drip. I could still see the shape of our marriage, but it was hollowing out beneath my feet. And still, I told myself it was just a season. People grow apart sometimes, but they grow back together, too, don't they? I clung to that hope like a life raft. I kept believing because the alternative, accepting that the man I had built a life with was drifting somewhere I couldn't follow, was too painful to name, at least not yet. It happened on a Sunday. Evan and his fiancée, Grace, had just gotten engaged, and we were throwing a small celebration at our house. Nothing fancy, just close friends and family, some catered food, a few balloons tied to the porch railing. I spent the entire morning preparing, polishing the silverware, ironing the tablecloth, arranging white hydrangeas and soft pink roses in the vase that used to belong to my grandmother. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted Evan to feel proud, to see how loved he was. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted James to see me again, to remember the woman he used to hold close. The guests started arriving around noon. James greeted them at the door like a politician. Smiles, firm handshakes, little jokes that made people laugh, even if they didn't quite hear the punchline. I watched him work the room, so polished and charming, while I stayed near the kitchen, making sure the quiches didn't burn. When it was time for the toast, everyone gathered in the living room. Evan stood next to Grace, beaming, her hand wrapped around his arm like she never wanted to let go. James raised his glass. He didn't prepare anything. He never did. He was always good at speaking off the cuff. To Evan and Grace, he began with that smooth voice that always made people lean in. "You two remind me of us back when we had no idea what we were doing, but we believed in each other anyway." Everyone chuckled. James continued, swirling the champagne in his glass. "May your love stay fresh. May you never stop listening. May you always have what your mother and I once had." The room went still. What your mother and I once had. Not what we have. Not what we still share. Once had. I felt the breath leave my body. My face froze in a smile, but my heart sank like it had been yanked underwater. He didn't even look at me. He just sipped from his glass, turned to Evan and said, "You've made us proud." People clapped. Grace leaned her head on Evan's shoulder. The music started again. Laughter returned to the room, but I stood there still holding a tray of lemon tarts, my fingers trembling. He hadn't meant it as an insult. That was the worst part. He didn't even realize what he'd said. It wasn't calculated. It was casual, thoughtless, like the idea of us, of me, had already been filed away in the past tense. I quietly placed the tray on the table and walked to the bathroom. I didn't cry. I stared at myself in the mirror and tried to remember the last time he looked at me like I mattered, like I was more than a placeholder in a house we used to build dreams in. When I returned, no one noticed I'd been gone. James was on the porch laughing with Evan's future in-laws. Grace was showing her engagement ring to one of her friends. I moved through the room, refilling drinks, clearing plates, smiling when spoken to. I played the part of the gracious hostess, the proud mother, the lucky wife. But inside, something cracked. That night, when the house was quiet again, I brought it up. "Your toast," I said softly. "What you said about what we once had." He was undressing for bed, folding his shirt with mechanical precision. He paused, confused. "What about it? It made it sound like we don't have that anymore." He blinked, tossed the shirt in the hamper. "It was just a figure of speech, Carlin. Don't make it into something it's not." He turned off the light before I could respond. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft whistle of his breath beside me. I was inches from him, but I felt miles away. Not because he said the wrong thing, but because he didn't understand why it hurt. That was the humiliation. Not just the words spoken in front of others. Not the way they fell so effortlessly from his lips, but the realization that he no longer saw me as his partner. I was just the woman he shared a mortgage with, the mother of his son. A memory already fading. And the worst part, I had smiled through it in front of everyone. There wasn't a final straw. No screaming match. No slammed doors. No suitcase thrown onto the lawn, just silence, slowly stretching itself out until it covered everything. James had become a man I lived beside, not with. We shared a bed, but not warmth. We shared a kitchen, but not conversations. He still brought in the mail, still folded his laundry, still paid the bills on time, but his eyes rarely met mine. And when they did, they passed over me like I was a familiar piece of furniture. I started sleeping with my back to him. At first, I thought it was temporary, just a bad season, a lull. Couples go through those. I told myself that more times than I can count. But one morning, I realized I couldn't remember the last time he kissed me goodbye. I'd stood by the window with my coffee, his old habit, and watched him pull out of the driveway without so much as a glance up at the house. That day, I packed my bags, not dramatically, not in a whirlwind of tears, quietly. I took the overnight bag I used when I visited my sister in Indianapolis and filled it with a few clothes, my toothbrush, my journal, and the pair of earrings James gave me on our 10th anniversary, just because I still loved them, not because I felt loved. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't even call my sister. I needed space to think without anyone asking questions, without anyone telling me what a good man James was, how lucky I was, how people my age should be grateful for stability. I drove 2 hours south to a small bed and breakfast by a lake I remembered from my childhood. My parents had taken me there once for a weekend when I was 9. Back then, it felt magical. Fireflies in the tall grass, the smell of pine, the sound of water slapping gently against the shore. I don't know what made me think of it, but the moment I pulled into that gravel driveway, something inside me exhaled for the first time in months. The owner, a gray-haired woman named Lois, didn't ask why I was there alone. She handed me a key, showed me to a small room with floral wallpaper and a rocking chair by the window, and left me in peace. That first night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and listened to the wind rustling the leaves. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was quiet, and it was mine. I stayed 3 nights. No one called. When I returned home, James didn't ask where I'd been. He glanced up from the paper as I came through the door, nodded once, and said, "Hey." That was it. No concern, no anger, no curiosity, just, "Hey." Like I'd stepped out for milk and come back 3 days later. And that's when I knew. He didn't even notice I was gone. Not really. My absence hadn't disrupted his life in any meaningful way. I could have been anyone. Any shadow passing through the hallways, any woman filling the fridge and washing the dishes. I was already gone in his mind. I didn't fight him. I didn't beg. I didn't list the ways I'd felt abandoned while still sleeping in his bed. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I'd waited too long for those already. I simply stepped back into my life, rearranged a few things, and kept my distance. Friends asked how we were. I smiled and said we were fine. Evan noticed the tension, but he was planning a wedding and too distracted to dig deeper. I let it be. I hadn't left the marriage, not on paper, but I had walked away from it in every other way that counted, and no one seemed to notice, which in its own way was the clearest proof of all. Rock bottom doesn't always come with screaming or breaking plates or dramatic exits. Sometimes it arrives in absolute stillness, in the quiet, when there's nothing left to say or do. It came for me the night before James's funeral. The house was too quiet. I had always thought of silence as peaceful. But that night, it felt oppressive. Every clock tick, every creak of the wood floors under my feet sounded deafening. I wandered through each room, unable to sit still. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The dining room table still had the table runner I'd bought last Christmas. A part of me wanted to flip it over, to ruin something, anything. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself standing in our bedroom doorway, staring at the side of the bed where he used to sleep. His side of the closet was still full, shirts pressed and hanging neatly, shoes lined in a perfect row. I knelt down and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were the usual things: socks, belts, a tangle of old chargers, and then, underneath a stack of ties, I found his watch. It was the one I gave him on our 20th anniversary. Silver with a small engraving on the back, "Still choosing you." He hadn't worn it in years. Said he didn't like the weight on his wrist anymore. But I remembered how proud he looked when he first opened the box. How he pulled me close and whispered, "You always know exactly what I need." I held the watch in my hand and sat down on the edge of the bed. The weight of it pressed into my palm, and suddenly it was hard to breathe. I didn't cry. I sobbed, the kind of sob that starts from the chest, shakes the spine, and leaves you gasping. I clutched the watch and folded it on myself like my body was trying to disappear. I wasn't just crying for James. I was crying for all the years I had waited for his attention, his affection, his return. I was mourning the woman I had been. The woman who used to believe that loyalty would protect her from heartbreak. It was then that I admitted it. Not to anyone else, but to myself. He hadn't loved me in years. And I had known. And I stayed. I buried the signs. I smiled through them. I clung to scraps, convinced they were enough. And now he was gone. And I would never get the apology I deserved. Never hear the truth. Never know why he let go of me while still keeping me close enough to do his laundry, answer his calls, and warm his dinner plate. It was almost morning by the time I pulled myself off the floor. My throat was raw. My eyes were swollen. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, but not broken. Hollowed out, but not empty. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the sun rise from the kitchen window, a warm orange glow spilling across the tiles. It was beautiful in that soft, indifferent way that made it worse. The world was still turning. The day had come, and I would bury my husband without ever truly knowing who he was. The funeral was scheduled for 11 a.m. I dressed slowly, choosing a black dress that I hadn't worn in years. It fit tighter than I remembered, hugging the parts of me that had aged without permission. I pinned up my hair, slid on my grandmother's earrings, and put on a face I could hide behind. When I stepped into the funeral home, the scent of lilies hit me like a wall. James had hated lilies, so they reminded him of death. I almost laughed at the irony. People began arriving one by one with their platitudes and their sadness. They shook my hand, touched my shoulder, offered kind words I barely heard. I stood by the casket and tried to remember who I had been before all of this. Before the socks, before the silence, before the woman named Belle, and the baby who would shatter everything I thought I knew. I didn't know it then, but that day, his funeral, wouldn't be the end of my story. It would be the beginning of the truth. 3 days after the funeral, I found the keys. I had gone back to the closet, not really looking for anything, just trying to feel close to him. His scent still lingered on the collars of his shirts. I stood there for a while, running my fingers along the fabric, half hoping I'd wake up from everything that had unfolded. But that's when I noticed it. One of his loafers was slightly out of place. James had always kept them lined up perfectly, toe to heel, like little soldiers waiting for inspection. But one shoe was turned sideways. I reached down, adjusted it, and there, just behind the pair, taped to the floor of the closet, was a small white envelope. Inside were 2 silver keys and a sticky note in James's handwriting. Box 113, Chase Bank. I sat back on my heels, my breath caught in my chest. We didn't have a safe deposit box, at least not one he ever mentioned. My mind raced. I told myself it could be old, something from before we merged accounts. Or maybe it was for storing documents like his father's will or his Navy papers. Still, the weight of secrecy pressed down on me like a stone. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The clerk behind the desk was young, polite, and unaware of the emotional tornado I was hiding beneath my coat. I handed her the keys and told her I was here for box 113. She checked my ID, typed something into her computer, then nodded and led me to the vault. The room was cold, quiet, the kind of quiet that demands reverence. She left me alone. My hands trembled as I turned the key and opened the metal door. Inside was a plain manila envelope and a stack of neatly banded $100 bills. I didn't count them right away. My attention was locked on the envelope. I pulled it out and slowly opened the flap. The first thing I saw was a birth certificate. Name, Micah D. Marraro. Date of birth, August 2nd. Father, James Alexander Marraro. Mother, Belle Nicole Hayes. I felt the room tilt, the air thinned. I read it again and again. Micah, the name the woman had said at the funeral, the baby she placed into my arms. I stared at the certificate, tracing the printed letters with my fingertip as if that might make it less real. James had a child, a son. Not from before me, not from a one-night mistake buried in our early years, but recently, in the last year, while I was still folding his shirts and asking him to pick up milk on the way home. I turned the paper over. A second document was tucked behind it. A letter dated just a few weeks before the crash. James' handwriting was uneven, less structured than usual, like he'd written it in a rush. Carlin, if you're reading this, I've failed you in ways I can't justify. There's no good way to tell you what I'm about to say. I never planned for this to happen. I made mistakes. I crossed lines I never should have. But I need you to know Micah didn't ask for any of this. He's a child. He's mine. And he's innocent. If I'm gone, it means he'll need someone. I trust no one more than you. I'm sorry for all of it, James. I read the letter 3 times before I could breathe again. My hands felt numb, my vision blurred. A part of me wanted to tear it up, to scream, to curse him out loud, but all I could do was sit there, frozen, with a dead man's confession in one hand and proof of his secret life in the other. The betrayal hit like a second death. I should have stormed out of that vault. I should have torn through the house, yelling and throwing everything he ever touched. But I didn't, because somewhere, not far from here, there was a baby with James's blood, a baby whose mother was dying, a baby who'd been carried into a funeral and placed into my arms by a woman I didn't know, and yet, who somehow knew exactly who I was. That envelope didn't just reveal his secret. It handed me a choice, and I wasn't ready for it. Not yet. I didn't leave the bank right away. After locking the box again, I sat in my car with the envelope pressed to my chest, the letter burning like a live coal inside it. My knuckles were white around the steering wheel. I stared straight ahead, watching the world go on, like it didn't just shatter inside me. I had spent my whole life trying to be good. A good wife, a good mother, a woman who didn't make scenes, who forgave quietly, who filled the house with warmth even when she was freezing inside. And what had that given me? A husband who died with secrets still warm in his hands. A child I hadn't known about until he was placed in my arms like a surprise I never asked for. A truth that twisted everything I thought I knew into a cruel knot. But even through the grief, something else stirred. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. When I looked back, it was all there. The vanishing affection, the private phone calls, the detachment that had taken root so slowly I'd convinced myself it was just time doing its work. But it wasn't time. It was betrayal. Small, daily betrayals, the kind that don't leave bruises on the skin, but break things inside you. 4 weeks, I had moved like a ghost. I made James' funeral arrangements, accepted condolences with a practiced nod, filled vases with sympathy flowers. I went through the motions of mourning without ever fully letting myself feel it. But sitting there in the parking lot with Micah's birth certificate and James's letter in my lap, I felt something return. A flicker. Not a forgiveness, but a fire. James hadn't given me the truth when he was alive, but now I had it. And I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to the version of myself who lived in the fog of denial. So I drove. Not home, not yet. I drove to the park on Sycamore Lane, the one Evan used to play in when he was little, the place where James once pushed him on the swing for an hour while I lay on a blanket, reading and sipping iced tea. I needed to be somewhere that reminded me I had once been whole. The trees were bare, the wind sharp. A few children played in the distance, their laughter rising and falling like waves. I sat on a bench near the sandbox, the envelope resting in my lap, and I let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding. What now? I wasn't young anymore. I was 58. My joints ached when it got cold. My back stiffened if I stood too long. I was supposed to be entering the soft, quiet season of life, grandchildren, books on the porch, a man beside me to fill in the blanks of my memory when I forgot what day it was. But instead, I had a baby who was part of my husband's secret life. A dying woman who had shown up at a funeral and handed me her child. A son who didn't yet know any of this. And a future that looked nothing like the one I'd spent decades building. And yet, as I sat there watching a toddler chase after a plastic shovel, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt awake. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I wasn't just existing. I was thinking, choosing, seeing clearly. Micah didn't ask to be born into this mess. And whatever I felt about James, the child was innocent. Could I love him? I didn't know. Could I raise him? I wasn't sure. But could I abandon him? No. That night, I pulled the baby's socks from my nightstand drawer, the same ones I found months ago in James' suitcase, and told myself were nothing. I laid them on the kitchen table and just stared. This was my beginning. Not the one I wanted, not the one I ever dreamed of, but a beginning all the same. I didn't tell anyone. Not Evan, not my sister, not my closest friend. Some things aren't meant to be shouted. Some truths need time to settle in your bones before you can carry them into the world. So I started quietly. The next day, I called the number scribbled on the corner of James's letter. It belonged to Belle, Micah's mother, the woman from the funeral, the woman whose name had appeared on his birth certificate, and who had shattered my reality with 7 soft-spoken words. She picked up after the second ring. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, as if the strength she used to walk into that funeral had since left her body. "Hello, Belle," I said, unsure whether to speak firmly or kindly. "It's Carlin Moraro." A pause. "Then I was hoping you'd call." We met the next morning at a small diner outside of town. She came in wearing a faded hoodie, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked exhausted, older than 35. Her skin was pale, her frame smaller than I remembered. She was holding Micah in a soft carrier wrapped tight against her chest. He was sleeping, peaceful, oblivious to the tangled mess of lives around him. We talked for 2 hours. She told me everything. She met James when she was working as a nurse during a short hospital stay 2 years ago. He visited her afterward, helped her financially when she was diagnosed with lymphoma. Their relationship started out as gratitude. It turned into something else. She never meant to destroy my life. She said, "I didn't even know he was married at first, and when I found out, I was already pregnant." I didn't forgive her. Not then. But I also didn't hate her. She was dying alone. No siblings. No parents. No one to take her son. She had come to the funeral not to expose James, but to find Micah a future. I left that meeting with more answers than I expected and a new kind of weight. Micah didn't just need shelter. He needed a legal guardian, a mother, a chance at a life untouched by lies. So I began preparing. Not loudly, not with drama. Quietly, deliberately. First, I called my lawyer and asked what it would take to secure guardianship. Then, I pulled some money from savings, enough to cover the paperwork, fees, and whatever expenses might come. I didn't tell Evan. I wasn't ready. Not until I understood the full picture. Next, I visited my doctor. I hadn't had a full checkup in a while, and if I was going to raise a baby at nearly 60, I needed to know what my body could still handle. The nurse blinked when I told her I might be parenting again, but she smiled. She said I looked healthier than most women 10 years younger. I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. At home, I began making changes. I cleared out the guest room. I folded away the old quilts and took down the framed prints that made the space feel like an afterthought. I ordered a crib. Not a fancy one, just something sturdy, something safe. I washed the sheets in lavender, the same scent I used when Evan was a baby. I didn't even realize I was humming until I caught myself in the hallway folding onesies while whispering a lullaby I hadn't sung in decades. I also started journaling again, not to document everything, but to remind myself who I was through this. Each night, I wrote down what I had learned about James, about Micah, about myself. Some entries were only a sentence long. Others filled pages, but they kept me grounded. The house felt different now. It was still quiet, still full of shadows, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting, preparing. I could feel it, the shift. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was moving with purpose. And though I didn't say a word to the world, I knew this. My life had broken open, and I was finally choosing what I filled it with. I've always believed power wasn't about who speaks the loudest, but who no longer needs to speak at all. In the weeks after I met with Belle and started preparing for Micah, I noticed the air around me change. Not dramatically, no fireworks, but something subtle, internal, like my spine had straightened without me realizing it. I stopped waiting for explanations that would never come. I stopped replaying James's words, trying to decode what he meant by every silence, every unfinished sentence. Instead, I moved forward. I found myself standing taller. Even as grief still circled me, it didn't control me anymore. It walked behind me. It no longer swallowed me whole. And the world, it noticed, not because I told anyone anything, but because I had stopped apologizing for my presence. Evan came by one afternoon, dropped off some mail, and paused in the hallway when he saw the freshly painted guest room, the crib, the folded baby clothes. "Mom," he said slowly, "what's going on in here?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the space I'd created. The clean sheets, the mobile hanging above the crib, the little stack of board books by the window. "It's for someone who needs a place to feel safe," I said. He stared at me. "Are you fostering a kid or something?" "Not exactly." He waited, clearly hoping I'd fill the silence, but I didn't. "Not yet." He walked out of the room confused, but not angry, and I felt no urge to explain myself. Let him wonder. Let the questions build. I had spent my life trying to ease everyone's discomfort. Not anymore. Across town, Belle's health declined rapidly. Her voice grew thinner on the phone. Sometimes, she called just to hear me breathe on the other end. Other times, she'd ask if Micah's room was ready, and I'd tell her softly, yes. She signed the papers 2 days after her third chemo round failed. My lawyer handled the transfer of temporary guardianship. No press, no chaos, just signatures, the doyen witnesses. A quiet shift in the foundation of my life. The day I brought Micah home for good, it rained. Not hard, just a light, steady drizzle that made the world smell like clean earth. He was wrapped in the same blue blanket Belle had placed him in at the funeral. He slept through the car ride. When I carried him inside, I paused in the entryway. I looked at the house that had once felt like a mausoleum, and I saw something different now. It felt like it had exhaled, like it had finally made room for something new. I placed Micah gently in the crib and stood there watching him breathe. His tiny chest rose and fell. One hand twitched in his sleep. I'd forgotten how fragile babies looked, how heavy they felt in your arms despite their size, how sacred silence could be when it came from a place of peace. I didn't cry. I just stood there knowing I'd never be the same. People started noticing. The neighbors asked questions, of course, quietly at first. "Carlin, is that a baby I heard the other night? Are you babysitting someone's grandson?" I smiled and said, "He's staying with me for a while." And no one pressed too hard, but I saw the curiosity in their eyes. I saw the shift in how they spoke to me, less patronizing, more respectful, as if they sensed I'd stepped into something stronger, something unshakable. Even at church, the whispers started, some gentle, some cruel. "She's raising a baby at her age. Didn't her husband just die?" But I walked into that sanctuary each week with Micah on my hip and my head held high. I didn't owe anyone answers. I wasn't carrying shame. I was carrying purpose. And James had become a shadow, a figure from a life I had outgrown. His memory still lived in the corners of this house. But now it had to make room for lullabies and midnight feedings. The power had shifted, not because I demanded it, because I stopped needing anyone else to hand it to me. I chose a Sunday afternoon to tell Evan. It had been building. His questions, his uncertainty, the way he looked at the crib every time he visited, his gaze darting between me and Micah, like he was trying to solve a puzzle without the picture on the box. He never asked directly. Not yet, but I could feel the weight of it in the air, thick and pressing, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. So I invited him over for lunch. Just the two of us, no Grace, no distractions. I made his favorite, chicken salad on croissants with a side of kettle chips, and set the table like I always did when he was a teenager and came home after a bad exam. It felt strange, comforting him with sandwiches when what I was about to say would tear the floor out from under him. He arrived in a hoodie and ball cap, hair still damp from the gym. He kissed my cheek, sniffed the air, and gave me a tired smile. "You didn't have to cook." "I wanted to," I said. "Sit. Eat first." We kept the conversation light. How work was going, how Grace was overwhelmed with wedding planning, how the Bengals were disappointing him again this season. I nodded, smiled, let him talk, and then, when the plates were pushed aside and the afternoon light spilled across the kitchen table like a soft warning, I cleared my throat. There's something I need to tell you. He looked up. The joking fell from his face like a mask slipping. Okay. I reached behind me and pulled out the envelope I'd kept hidden in a drawer for weeks. The birth certificate, the letter from James, the legal documents showing temporary guardianship. I placed them on the table in front of Evan like cards in a game I never wanted to play. He looked at them, confused at first. Then he picked up the certificate. Micah D. Maroro. Father, James Alexander Maroro. Mother, Belle Nicole Hayes. His hand froze. What is this? He asked, voice low. That, I said calmly, is your brother. He stared at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. No, he said, shaking his head. This has to be fake. Dad, a baby. Who? Who the hell is Belle? I told him everything. Not with drama, not to hurt him. Just the truth, one piece at a time. I told him how James met Belle, how he kept her and the child hidden. How Belle showed up at the funeral. How I found the safe deposit box, the letter, the truth. How Micah was left with no one else. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He just sat there, his hand gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When I finished, the silence between us was louder than any argument could have been. Finally, Evan leaned back in his chair and looked at me like I was a stranger. So what? You're just taking care of him now? Like nothing happened? Like none of this destroyed our family? No, I said. Not like nothing happened. Everything happened. Your father betrayed us. He lived a double life, and then he died and left the consequences in my lap. I took a deep breath. But Micah is not a consequence. He's a child, an innocent child who didn't choose any of this, and I won't punish him for James' choices. Evan stood up, his jaw clenched. His eyes were red but dry. So, you're just going to raise him like he's yours? I already am. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw it. The grief, the disbelief, the heartbreak that mirrored my own. I don't know if I can accept this, he said. I'm not asking you to accept it right now. I'm asking you not to turn your back on someone who never asked to be here. He said nothing more, just grabbed his jacket and left. The door closed behind him with a finality I hadn't expected. But I didn't chase him. I'd spent my whole life chasing peace, chasing approval, chasing love. This time, I stayed exactly where I was. 2 weeks passed. Evan didn't call. I didn't push him. I gave him the space I knew he needed. The kind I wish someone had given me when I first learned the truth. I kept showing up for Micah. Midnight feedings, early morning bottle warmings, diaper changes, lullabies whispered through a cracked voice. I hadn't done this in decades, but somehow my body remembered what to do. It was hard, yes, but it was also the first time in a long time I felt useful in a way that mattered. Then one quiet Thursday morning, the doorbell rang. Micah was asleep on my chest, so I eased him into the bassinet and patted down the hallway. When I opened the front door, I wasn't expecting to see a man in a gray blazer holding a leather briefcase. Mrs. Carlin Maroro? Yes. I'm Daniel Fields. I was your husband's estate attorney. May I come in? I blinked. I thought the will was already settled. There's a second file. A trust, actually. It was separate from his main estate. He instructed that it be delivered in person, but only after Micah was placed in your care. I stared at him for a moment, stunned. Then I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the dining room table, the same place where Evan had sat when I told him the truth, and opened the briefcase. Inside was a small stack of legal papers and a sealed envelope. This, he said, placing the papers gently on the table, is a trust fund James set up about a year ago. It holds approximately $250,000. The sole beneficiary is Micah Dean Maroro. You've been named the trustee. You have full control over its management, medical expenses, education, anything related to his care. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my ears. He slid the envelope toward me. He also left you a letter. I opened it with trembling fingers. Carlin, if this reaches you, it means everything I was afraid to face has come true. I never meant to deceive you for this long. I thought I could contain it, separated from the life we built. But secrets don't stay where you put them. Micah was a mistake in circumstance, not in spirit. He is innocent, and I know you. You always saw the child, not the shame. I've left what I could to help raise him. You're stronger than me. You always were. I hope somehow that this gives you even a sliver of the peace I couldn't give you while I was alive, James. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and looked at Daniel. Why didn't I know about this? James made it separate intentionally. He said he didn't want Micah's future to depend on how angry anyone was after he was gone. He said, excuse me, he said if anyone could protect a child without letting bitterness get in the way, it was you. I exhaled slowly, not out of forgiveness, but from the sheer weight of being handed the final piece of a puzzle I didn't ask to complete. When Daniel left, I sat in the nursery and watched Micah sleep. I traced the lines of his tiny hand with my finger and whispered, "You'll be okay. I don't know what comes next, but you'll be okay." The money didn't erase the betrayal, but it gave me something James had never offered while he was alive. Trust. Not in the romantic sense, but in the practical, in the concrete. He could have named anyone. He could have given that money to someone else to oversee, but he didn't. He gave it to me, not as an apology, but as a recognition. It was the closest thing to justice I was going to get. Not courtroom justice, not public vindication, but personal justice. The kind that lets you look in the mirror and say, I wasn't the fool. I was the one who stayed kind when I had every reason not to. James everyone else to hand it to me. James hadn't left me everything. But what? System. He did leave was enough. Not to rebuild the life we had, but to build something new. It was a Sunday evening when Evan came back. I wasn't expecting him. There was no text, no call, no heads up. I had just finished bathing Micah, wrapping him in a warm towel and humming softly as I rocked him by the window. The house smelled faintly of lavender and formula. Outside, the sky was streaked with gold and purple, the kind of sky that made you pause no matter what kind of day you'd had. The knock at the door was hesitant, not urgent, just unsure. When I opened it, Evan stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes bloodshot. Not from tears, I thought, but from thinking too hard, too long. I didn't know if you'd want to see me, he said. I stepped aside. You're always welcome. He walked in slowly, looking around like the house had changed since the last time he stood in it. And in a way it had. So had I. He spotted Micah in the bassinet and paused. The baby was still awake, blinking sleepily at the soft mobile above his head. That's him. I nodded. That's Micah. He didn't move closer right away, just stood there, hands clenched at his sides, breathing like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to. I've been trying to figure out how to feel, he said. Part of me is furious. Another part feels like I don't even know who Dad was. But mostly I feel like I've been lied to, and I don't know how to make peace with any of it. I sat down on the couch, leaving space beside me. I didn't pressure him. I didn't offer advice or a neat little answer. Instead, I said, you're allowed to feel all of it, and you don't have to make peace with it overnight. He sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Did you ever suspect anything? I swallowed. Yes, but I didn't want to believe it. I told myself stories to fill the gaps because sometimes it's easier to live in what you hope is true than to face what actually is. He nodded, eyes still downcast. What was he thinking, Mom? Having another child? Keeping it a secret? Did he think he'd never get caught? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, I think he thought he had time. Time to fix it maybe, or hide it, or explain it on his terms, but time ran out. Micah let out a soft gurgle, pulling both our attention. Evan stood and approached the bassinet slowly. He looked down at the baby, his half-brother, and for a long moment said nothing, just watched. Micah blinked up at him, then reached out with a tiny hand. Evan hesitated, then he extended a finger. Micah grabbed it. That simple gesture broke something in both of us. Evan cleared his throat. He has Dad's eyes. I nodded. And your chin. He gave a small, bitter laugh. Great. Another Marora with that stubborn jaw. We stood there in silence, watching Micah kick gently beneath his blanket. Finally, Evan looked at me. I'm not saying I'm okay with everything, but I don't want to pretend he doesn't exist. That kid didn't choose any of this. No, I agreed, my voice soft. He didn't. He rubbed the back of his neck. I talked to Grace about it. She was shocked, obviously. But she said something that stuck with me. She said, "You don't have to be ready to love him, but don't make the mistake of shutting the door before you even know what's on the other side." I smiled. She's a wise woman. She is, he said, then looked back at me. So what now? You raise him. You really think you can do this again? I don't know, I said honestly. But I know I want to try, and I'd like you to be part of his life if you're ready. He looked at Micah again, then back at me. Maybe I could come by next weekend, bring diapers, or help with feeding. I don't know what I'm doing, but I guess we could figure it out together. I reached out and squeezed his hand. You already know more than you think. As the sky darkened outside, the three of us stood there, me, my son, and his brother, a strange, unexpected family stitched together by betrayal, grief, and the quiet decision to try again. Some nights, after Micah has fallen asleep, I sit on the back porch with a blanket over my knees and a cup of tea in my hands. The world is quiet then, softened by moonlight and the rhythmic chirping of crickets. It's in these moments, when the house finally exhales, when there are no questions to answer or diapers to change, that I allow myself to look back, not in bitterness, not anymore, but with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've been completely unmade. James is still with me in strange ways, not in the romantic way he used to be. No warm glances across the room, no shared jokes, no familiar presence in bed beside me, but in fragments, in memories that show up like visitors I didn't invite, but don't always mind. A song on the radio he used to hum. The smell of wood polish he always used on the dining room table. The sound of Evan laughing, which is somehow still so much like his father's. It makes my chest ache. And now, of course, in Micah. There are mornings when I lift him from his crib, and he looks up at me with those wide hazel eyes, and I see James. Not the man who lied to me, not the man who disappointed me, but the young version, the boy I fell in love with decades ago, who held my hand in a movie theater and promised me forever. There are pieces of that boy in this child. And though I don't forgive James for what he did, I've stopped trying to hate him. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on love. Micah is crawling now. I catch him trying to pull himself up onto the coffee table, determined to conquer whatever's in front of him. That determination, that stubbornness, I recognize it. I smile at it. I encourage it because he will grow up knowing the truth. Not the details of his father's betrayal, not yet, but the truth that he was wanted, chosen, raised not in secrecy but in light. He will know that even when the beginning of his story was born in silence, his life was reclaimed with intention. And Evan, he's coming around slowly, carefully. He shows up on weekends with a box of wipes or a toy Grace picked out. He holds Micah awkwardly, like the baby might break, but he's trying. Last week, he fed him a bottle while watching a baseball game with the volume low, his voice soft as he narrated every play. I didn't say anything. I just watched from the kitchen doorway, my heart full in a way I didn't expect. We're not the same family we used to be, but maybe we're something better. We are now truthful, imperfect, recovering, and shaped by suffering, but not by it. I've discovered that there is no end to grief. You never move on from it. It's with you. You create space for it, and if you're lucky, something new could bloom in that space. Love, I've discovered, is a choice. It's the hard kind, not the easy type that comes with bouquets and butterflies. The sort you decide on in the middle of the night when you're worn out, your heart hurts, and the person you previously trusted isn't around to take responsibility for their actions. The sort you pick when you welcome a child into your life who didn't fit into your plans but ended up there nevertheless. Micah is my second opportunity at unconditional love. Additionally, I could be his first opportunity at a stable job. I reflect on how far I've come as I rock him in the nursery tonight while the moonlight streams in through the curtains. How the smell of warm milk, gentle music, and baby smiles have replaced the quiet and sorrow that once permeated our dwelling. I don't have to tell everyone everything. I know that what I constructed from the ashes of betrayal was more than simply a house. Therefore, I don't need to defend my decisions. I was the one. And for that, more than anything else, I will always be thankful for the life I never imagined.